The dew had not yet lifted from the hedgerows of Ashcombe Park when Eleanor Winslow trampled a bed of new planted asters and earned herself the coldest set of eyes she had ever met in her 23 years. "Have a care, madam," the man growled, not looking up from the soil he knelt in. "Those roots have not taken yet. Another careless boot, and they will not take at all." She froze mid-step, one slipper still crushing a stem, her face going hot with the particular shame of being caught doing something small and thoughtless by someone who had every right to be irritated with her. She had come out before breakfast precisely to avoid being seen by anyone, to walk the grounds of her family's host in peace before the day's performances began. The smiling, the curtsying, the careful arrangement of herself into a shape no one would notice. And now here she was, ruining a gardener's morning's work and being reprimanded like a child. "I am so sorry," she said, stepping back at once, though there was nowhere to step that did not risk another bed. "I wasn't watching where I walked. I never even saw the planting, the mist, I suppose, and my own foolishness. Please, let me help you set it right." The man finally looked up. He was younger than she had expected from the gruffness of his voice, perhaps 30, with a jaw that had not been shaved that morning and hands stained dark with earth. His coat was plain, workman's wool, his shirt open at the collar in a way no gentleman would permit himself to be seen, but his eyes, when they met hers, held something that did not belong to a man who spent his life on his knees in flower beds. A stillness, an assessing quality, as though he were reading a ledger rather than looking at a woman who had just ruined his aster bed. "You needn't trouble yourself," he said, and though the words were clipped, something in his tone had already softened. Curious to spite himself. "It is only a flower, it is your work," she said. "That is not only anything." She knelt without waiting for permission, careful now, and began pressing the loosened soil back around the stem she had crushed, though she knew nothing of gardening and could see, even as she did it, that her efforts were probably making things worse. "I am dreadfully sorry. Truly, I know what it is to have one's work go unnoticed and then be undone by someone else's carelessness." Something flickered across his face. Surprise, she thought, though she could not have said why an apology from a guest should surprise a gardener so completely. "Do you?" he said quietly. "Not quite a question. I manage my father's household accounts," she said, before she could think better of confiding such an unglamorous truth to a stranger. "No one thanks you for a ledger that balances. They only notice when it does not." She laughed a little, embarrassed at herself, and sat back on her heels. "Forgive me. You did not ask for my history. I am only trying to explain why I understand what it is to ruin something someone else built with care." He was quiet for a long moment, studying her in a way that made her suddenly conscious of her plain grey morning dress, her hair coming loose from its pins, the mud now on her palms. She had the strange sensation of being weighed, and, more strangely still, of not minding it. "What is your name?" he asked. "Eleanor," she said, and then, feeling it wanted more, "Eleanor Winslow. My family is newly arrived at the house. We are guests of Lord Ashcombe for the summer, though I confess I have not yet had the honour of meeting him. My sister is the one everyone wishes to meet him. I am only the one who counts the candles. Something like amusement, dry, private, passed behind the stranger's eyes. The one who counts the candles, he repeated, as if turning a coin over to see both faces of it. That seems an unjust reduction of a woman who kneels in the dirt to repair a flower bed she did not need to repair. You did not seem the sort who would forgive a trampled aster otherwise, she said, and was startled to hear herself teasing a man she had known for less than 5 minutes, a gardener, no less, whom she ought to have simply apologized to and left. But there was something in his manner that made her forget the careful distances she had spent a lifetime learning to keep. I am not, as a rule, forgiving, he said. You may ask anyone in this household. Then I am fortunate to have caught you at your gentlest hour. For the first time, something that was almost a smile touched the corner of his mouth, though he seemed to catch it and put it away before it could fully form, the way a man puts away a coin he does not wish to spend. You had better go in before you are missed, Miss Winslow, he said, rising and offering her his hand to help her up. An oddly courtly gesture from a man with soil beneath his nails. Your family will wonder where their ledger-keeper has gone. She took his hand. It was warm and rougher than she expected, and for one unaccountable moment she did not want to let it go. I don't suppose I've learned your name, she said. He hesitated, the smallest fraction of a pause, the kind she would only understand the meaning of much later, when it was too late to unknow it. Hartley, he said. You may call me Hartley. It was not, in fact, a lie. Not entirely. It was his mother's family name, buried 3 generations back. And it came to him the way a man reaches for a coat left on a peg by long habit. Because he had not been Julian Ashcombe, Marquess of Ashcombe, in this garden for 11 months now, not since his brother's funeral, not since he had discovered that the only hours in which he could breathe freely were the ones spent with his hands in soil that did not care what he was called. Mr. Hartley, Eleanor said, and dropped a small, genuine curtsy, the kind she gave to no one at breakfast. Thank you for your patience with my clumsiness. Miss Winslow, he said, and watched her go, and told himself, quite firmly, quite uselessly, that he would think no more of her. He was wrong within the hour. Eleanor returned to the house through the side door reserved for servants, not because she was ashamed of where she had been, but because it was closer, and because some instinct told her that if her mother saw the state of her hymn and her hands, there would be a scene before breakfast was even served. She was not wrong to fear it. Mrs. Winslow had spent the whole of the carriage journey to Ashcombe Park rehearsing, aloud, the precise number of ways in which Cassandra might catch the eye of the young and famously reclusive Marquess, and had spared, by Eleanor's count, exactly 1 sentence for her elder daughter, which had been, "Do try not to be underfoot. Eleanor, this is Cassandra's summer." It was not spoken with cruelty. That was in some ways the worst of it. It was spoken the way one might note the weather, a simple, settled fact that required no debate. Eleanor was not the pretty one. Eleanor was not the charming one. Eleanor was 3 years the elder, unmarried at 23, in a family that could not afford 2 unmarried daughters, and so it had been decided, long before Eleanor herself had any say in it, that she was the sensible one, the useful one, the one who kept the household running so that Cassandra's beauty might be given every possible advantage to shine. She had made her peace with it, mostly, or told herself she had. It was easier to manage a peace with a wound you had stopped examining than to look at it fresh each morning and find it still bleeding. "There you are," Cassandra said, sweeping into the breakfast room in a morning gown, the exact shade of a robin's egg, her golden curls already dressed though it was not yet 9 o'clock. "Mamma has been asking after you. Where on earth have you been? You look as though you've been rolling in a hedge." "I was walking in the gardens," Eleanor said, taking her seat and reaching for the toast rack, aware of her mother's eyes narrowing at the state of her hands. "Alone? Before breakfast?" Eleanor, really Mrs. Winslow, set down her teacup with the particular precision of a woman biting back a larger complaint in favour of a smaller, more manageable one. "You might have been seen by anyone. What if Lord Ashcombe himself had come upon you looking like a milkmaid?" "I doubt very much Lord Ashcombe rises before 9 to inspect his guests' hemlines," Eleanor said, and did not mention the gardener, though she found, oddly, that she did not want to. It had been, she searched for the word, and settled, privately, on hers, a small, strange, unremarkable thing that belonged only to her, in a summer that otherwise belonged entirely to her sister. "No one has even seen him yet," Cassandra said, sitting with a sigh that managed to be both elegant and aggrieved. "We have been here 4 days, and the man has not shown his face once. Lady Farnham says he has not attended a single dinner since his brother died. She says he has grown quite strange up at the house, shutting himself away, refusing callers. It is terribly Gothic, don't you think? A grieving Marquess hidden in his own home." "It sounds lonely," Eleanor said before she could stop herself. "Not Gothic." Her mother waved this away as though it were a fly. "It sounds like a young man who needs a wife to draw him out of his sulk, and a great deal of money in need of a sensible steward's hand, which he clearly is too occupied with his grief to provide himself. The gardens alone have gone half wild in places. Did you not notice, Eleanor, walking through them? I am told he dismissed half the staff last winter and has not troubled to replace them." Eleanor thought of the man kneeling in the dirt, his coat plain, his hands rough, tending a single bed of asters as though the whole of his peace depended upon it, and said nothing at all. She did not see Mr. Hartley again for 3 days, though she found herself walking the same path each morning with a persistence she did not examine too closely. On the 4th morning, she found him not among the asters, but in the old orangery at the garden's edge, repairing a broken pane of glass with the careful, unhurried movements of a man who had nowhere else he needed to be. "You've come back," he said without turning, as though he had heard her step and known it before she spoke. "I wanted to see whether the asters survived my carelessness. They survived. Barely, rather like my patience that first morning." But he was smiling when he said it, a real smile this time, one he did not put away. She found, over the following fortnight, that she came to the gardens not merely out of habit, but out of something closer to hunger. A hunger to be spoken to as though she were a person of interest rather than a ledger that balanced. Hartley asked her questions no one else troubled to ask. What she thought of the new agricultural improvements she had read about in her father's newspapers. Whether she believed a woman ought to have the keeping of her own money after marriage. What she would do, if she could do anything at all, and were not required to count candles for a family that scarcely noticed when she entered a room. "I should like to see the sea," she told him once, sitting on the low stone wall of the orangery while he worked. "I have never seen it." "Is that not absurd at 23? My whole life spent 40 miles from a coast I have never once visited." "It is not absurd," he said. "It is only unfinished. There is a difference. You speak like a man who has finished a great many things and grown weary of them," she said, watching him. "For a gardener, Miss Hartley, you have a curious way of talking." He did not answer that at once. She had learned by then to recognize the particular quality of his silences, not evasive, exactly, but weighted, as though each word he chose to withhold cost him something to withhold. "I read a great deal," he said finally. "A man alone has time for little else. Are you alone? Truly?" She had not meant to ask something so forward, but it was out before she could call it back. "More than I would choose to be," he said, and there was a rawness in it that made her want, quite fiercely, to reach for his hand, an impulse she did not act upon, though she thought. From the way his eyes flicked briefly to hers and away again, that he had felt the same impulse and mastered it just as firmly. It was in the third week that the first true fracture opened between what she believed and what was, in fact, true, though she did not recognize it as such at the time, only as a small, curious inconsistency, the kind one notices and then reasons away because the alternative explanation is too large to hold. She had gone to the orangery in the early evening, later than her usual hour, having escaped a wearisome dinner during which her mother had spent 40 minutes cataloguing Cassandra's virtues to Lady Farnham, while Eleanor sat, as she so often did, at the edge of the conversation like a chair no one had thought to remove from the room. She found Mr. Hartley not tending plants, but standing at the orangery's far window, looking out over the dark lawn toward the great house, its windows lit gold against the blue evening. "You look as though you are looking at something you have lost," she said gently, coming to stand beside him. "Perhaps I am," he said, without turning. "It is easy to lose a house, Miss Winslow, even while you are standing inside it. That sounds like something a poet would say, not a gardener." He turned to her then, and there was something in his face she had not seen before, a kind of naked weariness, quickly veiled. "I have not always been a gardener," he said. "No?" She waited, breath held, for the sentence that would follow, for the door she felt certain was about to open. But a bell rang somewhere in the great house, the summons for the second dinner course, for the guests who had not yet been informed that dinner had in fact already begun without the errant Miss Winslow. And the moment closed as quickly as it had opened. "You had better go in," he said, the shutters coming down over his face again, though more gently this time, as though he regretted the closing even as he performed it. "Before you are missed twice in 1 week. Your mother will begin to suspect you of keeping company with the gardener." "Would that be so terrible?" she asked, and heard, too late, how much of her heart was in the question. He looked at her for a long moment, and she thought, she was almost certain, that he was about to say something that would change everything. Instead, he said, quietly, "Go in, Eleanor," and it was the first time he had used her Christian name, and it undid her more thoroughly than any declaration could have. She went. But she did not sleep well that night, turning over in her mind the strange weight of I have not always been a gardener, and the stranger weight still of the way he had looked at the great house as a man looks at something he has lost while still, somehow, standing inside it. The truth, when it came sideways, as truth so often does, not from Mr. Hartley himself, but from Lady Farnham's sharp-tongued niece, Miss Priscilla Dean, who arrived at Ashcombe Park a week later trailing gossip the way some women trail perfume. "You will not credit what I have heard," Priscilla announced at breakfast, to an audience that included Eleanor, Cassandra, Mrs. Winslow, and 3 other lounging guests who had nothing better to occupy a rainy morning than the delicious prospect of scandal. "Lord Ashcombe has been actually seen, in the flesh, by one of the under gardeners, no less, walking the grounds in the early mornings dressed as plain as a labourer. Old Simmons, the head gardener, swears he has been doing it for the better part of a year, ever since the old Marquess and his elder son died within the same winter. Grief has turned his mind quite peculiar, they say. He will not receive callers as himself, but he wanders his own gardens in disguise, watching his guests as though he were a common man among them, listening to what is said of him when he believes himself unrecognized." Eleanor's toast turned to ash in her mouth. "How extraordinary," Mrs. Winslow said. "Delighted, and no one has thought to identify him. Old Simmons says he goes by Hartley, when anyone troubles to ask, his mother's family name, apparently. God rest her." Priscilla lowered her voice with theatrical relish. "I am told he has been seen speaking a great deal, this past fortnight, with one of the young ladies presently under this very roof, though I could not learn which." The room's attention turned as one toward Cassandra, whose face bloomed with delighted confusion. She had not, to her evident chagrin, spoken to any gardener at all, and then, more slowly, toward Eleanor, whose face had gone entirely, unmistakably white. "Eleanor," her mother said, in a voice gone suddenly sharp with calculation rather than concern, "you have been walking in the gardens every morning for a month." Eleanor set down her toast with hands that had begun, very slightly, to shake. She did not go to the orangery that evening. She could not have said afterward precisely what she felt in those first hours. Grief, she thought later, though it made no sense to grieve a man who had not died, only a man who had, in some essential way, never fully existed at all, not as she had believed him to exist. Every confidence she had given him, her longing for the sea, her private accounting of her own smallness in her family's arithmetic, the unguarded, foolish tenderness she had allowed herself to feel for a man with soil beneath his nails, all of it had been given to the Marquess of Ashcombe, one of the most powerful men in the county, a man who could, with a single sentence, ruin her family's summer, her reputation, her sister's chances, everything, and he had let her hand it to him without once telling her what she was placing in his hands. "You had better go in before you are missed," he had said so many times with such gentle care, and she had thought it tenderness, when perhaps it had only ever been a man toying, however kindly, with a woman who did not know the rules of the game she had unwittingly agreed to play. She wept that night with a violence that frightened her, muffling the sound in her pillow so that Cassandra, asleep in the next room, would not wake and ask questions Eleanor had no wish to answer. It was not merely humiliation, though humiliation was in it, hot and shaming. It was the particular grief of having believed, for one golden fortnight, that she had been seen, truly seen, for the first time in her adult life, by someone who wanted nothing from her, and discovering that the seeing had been, all along, one-sided, that he had known everything about her, while she had known nothing true about him at all. She did not go to the gardens the next morning, nor the morning after that. He noticed, of course he noticed. Julian Ashcombe noticed everything. It was the curse and the gift of a mind that had spent a year learning to read the smallest movements of people who did not know they were being read. And the absence of Eleanor Winslow from the orangery each dawn struck him with a force he had not expected, and did not at first wish to examine. He told himself the first morning that she had merely slept late, the second morning that the rain had kept her in. By the third, standing alone among the asters with a hollowness in his chest he recognized, with some private horror, as loneliness. A loneliness sharper than any he had felt in the 11 months since his brother's death, because this one had a shape, and the shape was her absence, he understood, with the particular clarity of a man forced at last to look directly at what he has been avoiding, that she knew. He found out how within the hour, from his own valet, who had heard it from a housemaid, who had heard it from Priscilla Dean's maid, that the whole house now knew the gardener called Hartley was, in fact, their host, and that Miss Eleanor Winslow, the elder, plainer Winslow daughter, the one nobody troubled to gossip about, ordinarily, had been keeping daily company with him for the better part of a month, without either family suspecting a thing. Julian sat for a long while in his study that morning, the account books he could not bring himself to look at spread untouched before him, turning over in his mind the memory of Eleanor kneeling in the dirt on their first meeting, apologizing with a sincerity he had not encountered from another human being since his mother died. "I know what it is to have one's work go unnoticed," and understood, with the sick lurch of a man recognizing his own failure a moment too late, precisely what he had done to her. He had not lied to her, not exactly. He had simply allowed her to believe a smaller, safer truth, because the smaller truth had let him be, for one summer, a man rather than a title, a man who could be teased about his patience, complimented on his conversation, sought out not for his rents or his name, but for himself. He had told himself, in the private chambers of his own conscience, that he meant to tell her eventually, that he was only waiting for the right moment, and had not noticed, or had not let himself notice, that each day he waited was another day he permitted her to hand him pieces of her heart he had no right to accept under a false name. She apologized to me, he thought, with something like anguish, before she even knew who I was, and now she believes the apology was wasted on a lie. He rose and did not go to his account books and did not go to his correspondence, and instead walked directly to the guest wing of his own house for the first time in 11 months, and asked of a startled housemaid where he might find Miss Eleanor Winslow. She was in the small morning room at the rear of the house, alone, staring at a piece of needlework she had not touched in 20 minutes, when the door opened and Julian Ashcombe, dressed now as himself, in a coat of fine dark wool, his jaw shaved, his bearing entirely altered, and yet, beneath it, entirely the same man who had knelt among the asters, stepped inside and closed the door softly behind him. She rose at once, because propriety demanded it, and because her legs seemed to require the excuse of movement to keep from trembling. "My lord," she said, and the two words carried in them all the distance he had, without meaning to, placed between them. "Don't," he said, quietly, "please, not that. Not from you. What else am I to call you?" Her voice was steady, though it cost her a great deal to make it so. "I called you Hartley for a month, my lord, and thought I was speaking to a man with nothing to hide. I see now that I was speaking to a Marquess who had a great deal to hide, and chose each day to let me go on believing otherwise. I did not set out to deceive you," he said. "You must believe that, whatever else you believe of me. I gave you my mother's name because it was the only name I had left that did not come attached to a house full of people who wanted something from me. I did not know, that first morning, that I would come to want to keep speaking with you every day that followed. If I had known, I promise you, Eleanor, I would have told you the truth the very next morning, and risked losing what I had only just found. But you did not tell me," she said, "not the next morning, nor any morning after. You let me sit in your orangery and tell you I had never seen the sea, and complain to you of my own family's carelessness with my feelings, and you said nothing, though you must have known every day that the not telling grew crueler the longer it went on." "I know it," he said, and the raw honesty of it stopped her, briefly, from continuing. "I have no defence for it that does not sound like a coward's excuse, because it was a coward's excuse. I was afraid, Eleanor, not of you, never of you. I was afraid of what would change the moment you knew what I was. I have spent 11 months watching every person who enters this house look at me and calculate what my title is worth to them. My own brother's death was announced in the London papers alongside a list of the eligible young ladies who might now consider a bid for Ashcombe. I did not want to watch that same calculation cross your face. I could not bear it, and so I let the lie continue a day longer than I should have, and then another, and then it had gone on so long that telling you the truth felt like it would cost me the very thing I most wanted to keep." Her eyes had filled, despite her best efforts, though she blinked hard against it. "You might have trusted me to be better than that calculation. I know that now," he said. "I did not know it then. I know only that I was a coward, and that you are owed better than a coward's apology, and I have come to offer it to you regardless, because it is the only honest thing left in my power to give you." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Outside, the rain had begun again, soft against the window panes, and somewhere in the house a door closed, and the ordinary sounds of a summer household went on as though nothing extraordinary were occurring within this one small room. "I do not know how to trust it," Eleanor said finally, very quietly. "Any of it. I do not know which parts of Mr. Hartley belong to you, and which parts were only ever a costume you put on because it was convenient to wear. I do not know whether the man who asked me what I would do if I could do anything at all was truly curious, or only amusing himself with a woman who did not know she was being observed like a specimen. The accusation struck him visibly, and he did not flinch from it, which she noted, despite herself, as a mark in his favour. "Then let me tell you what was true," he said. "Everything I asked you, I asked because I wanted the answer. Not because I was testing you, and not because I was amusing myself. I have sat through 100 dinners with women who wished to know my income, and not one who wished to know what I read, or what I had lost, or whether I was lonely. You asked me if I was alone, Eleanor, on an evening in the orangery, and I told you more truth in that one moment than I have told anyone in 11 months. That was not a costume. That was the first honest conversation I have had since my brother died." She looked at him for a long moment, searching his face the way she had searched it that very first morning among the asters, and found there the same stillness, the same weighted quiet, and understood with a kind of aching clarity that whatever else had been false between them, that particular quality in him, the quality that had drawn her to him in the first place, had never once been a performance. "I need time," she said finally. "I cannot simply set aside a month of believing one thing because you have now told me another. I am not angry that you are a marquess, my lord. I am grieved that you let me love a gardener before I was permitted to know I might be loving you." The word love, spoken so plainly, seemed to cost her something to release, and it cost him something to hear. A visible tightening around his eyes, as though she had struck a wound he had not known was still open. "Then I will give you the time," he said. "However much of it you require. I will not press you, and I will not pretend to you again in any fashion ever, but I would ask one thing of you, Eleanor, if you will grant it. Do not let what my family's name has cost you convince you that the man in the orangery was never real. He was the truest version of myself I have been in a very long time. I would rather you hated Julian Ashcombe, Marquess of Ashcombe, than believe that Hartley the gardener was nothing more than a lie." He left her then, as he had promised, without pressing further, and Eleanor sat alone in the small morning room for a long while after the door had closed, her needlework forgotten entirely in her lap, turning over in her mind a truth she was not yet ready to admit even to herself, that despite everything, despite the humiliation and the grief and the raw unfairness of having been deceived by a man she had trusted precisely because she believed him safe, she did not hate him. She had tried, in the days since Priscilla Dean's gossip, to summon a clean and simple anger, the kind that would let her close the door on the whole business and return to counting candles with her heart intact. But the anger would not hold its shape. Beneath it, stubbornly, persistently, was the same warmth she had felt in the orangery each evening. The same sense of having been, for the first time in her life, genuinely interesting to another human being, and she did not know how to reconcile that warmth with the wound. She did not have long to sit with the question in private, for her mother descended upon her within the hour, having heard, as the whole house had now heard, that it was Eleanor, and not Cassandra, who had spent a month in the company of the Marquess of Ashcombe, and Mrs. Winslow's fury at having wasted a summer's careful strategy on the wrong daughter was matched only by her sudden, dizzying recalculation of what an alliance between Eleanor and a marquess might mean for the family's fortunes. "You will go to him at once and smooth this over," her mother said, sweeping into the morning room with an energy Eleanor had rarely seen directed at her. "Whatever foolish pride has kept you sulking in here, set it aside. A marquess, Eleanor. Do you understand what this could mean for your father, for Cassandra's own prospects, for all of us? You will not throw away such a chance over wounded feelings." "This is not a strategy, Mother," Eleanor said, rising with a steadiness that surprised even her. "I will not go to him because it is advantageous to the family. If I go to him at all, it will be because I have decided, in my own time and by my own judgment, whether I can trust what passed between us. Not because you have suddenly discovered a use for me." Her mother's face flushed with an anger that had, beneath it, the unmistakable sting of having been accurately seen. "You ungrateful girl. Do you know how many years I have?" "I know precisely how many years," Eleanor said quietly, "because I have counted every candle in this house for most of them, unthanked, while you counted Cassandra's suitors instead. I do not say it to wound you, Mother. I say it because it is, at last, the truth, and I find I am rather tired of everything in my life being decided by everyone except myself." She left the room before her mother could recover a reply, and if her hands were shaking as she climbed the stairs to her own chamber, it was not entirely from fear. The days that followed carried a strange, suspended quality, as though the whole household were holding its breath around the scandal it could not stop discussing. Cassandra, to her credit, proved gentler than Eleanor had expected, seeking her out on the second evening with an uncharacteristic softness. "I am not angry that it was you," Cassandra said, sitting on the edge of Eleanor's bed while Eleanor brushed out her hair before the glass. "I confess I was, a little. At first, it is a strange thing to discover one's own sister has been quietly living a story more interesting than one's own. But Eleanor, you have loved him, haven't you? Not the Marquess, the gardener. I could see it in your face at breakfast every morning this past month, though I did not know the reason for it." Eleanor set down her brush. "I don't know what I feel anymore. I feel foolish, mostly, and frightened that whatever I did feel was built on ground that was never as solid as I believed. Or," Cassandra said gently, "it was built on the only solid ground he had left to offer you. And he has spent this past week trying to find a way to give you the rest of it too." She reached over and squeezed Eleanor's hand. "I have watched Mother arrange my whole life around what I might catch. I do not think I have ever once watched a man look at you the way Lord Ashcombe looked at Mother in the hallway yesterday when she tried to press him about your prospects. He looked at her as though she had insulted something sacred. I do not think that is the look of a man playing a game, Eleanor. Eleanor did not answer, but she did not sleep that night either, turning her sister's words over until dawn began to grey the curtains. There was, however, one further trial to endure before the ball, and it came in the shape of Lady Farnham's own sister, the formidable Aunt Constance, who arrived at Ashcombe Park 2 days later with the express purpose, it soon became clear, of putting an end to the whole business before it could take root any further than it already had. Aunt Constance had buried 2 husbands and outlived a great deal of other people's foolishness, and she made no secret, over tea on the second afternoon, of considering Eleanor's brief history with the Marquess a piece of foolishness ripe for ending. "You cannot seriously entertain it," she said to Eleanor, drawing her aside into the small parlour with the brisk authority of a woman accustomed to being obeyed. "A Marquess does not marry where sentiment leads him, whatever pretty speeches he has made you. He marries where duty and blood demand it, and I have it on the best authority that his late father, before his death, had all but settled an understanding between Julian and Lady Sophronia Vane, whose family holds the neighbouring estate, and whose dowry would join 2 of the largest properties in the county. Do you imagine, Miss Winslow, that a man raised from the cradle to understand his obligations will cast aside such an alliance for a woman with no fortune and no name, merely because she was kind to him while he played at being a gardener?" The words found the oldest wound in Eleanor with unerring precision, the wound that had, for 23 years, told her she was the daughter who did not merit consideration when weighed against advantage, and she felt it open freshly beneath Aunt Constance's cool, practised cruelty. "I have made him no demands," Eleanor said, though her voice was not quite steady. "If his duty calls him elsewhere, I shall not stand in its way." "See that you do not," Aunt Constance said, not unkindly, though not gently either. "I have watched a great many young women mistake a lonely man's gratitude for love, and I have watched every one of them pay dearly for the error. Spare yourself the grief, child, and withdraw before the whole county watches you humiliated a second time." Eleanor did not repeat this conversation to Julian, telling herself it was pride that kept her silent, though it was closer, in truth, to fear. The fear that Aunt Constance might, after all, be speaking a truth Eleanor had simply been too willing to overlook in her own eagerness to be chosen. She spent the following day pale and distracted, turning over the phrase Lady Sophronia Vane until it had worn a groove in her thoughts, and when Julian called at the house that afternoon, she received him with a careful, guarded politeness that he noticed at once. "Something has changed," he said, watching her across the morning room with the same close attention he had once turned on a woman kneeling in his flower bed. "You will not look at me directly. Tell me what has happened, Eleanor. I promised you no more concealments, and I meant it to run in both directions." She told him, then, of Aunt Constance's warning, watching his face for the flicker of guilt or evasion that would confirm her worst fear. Instead, his expression hardened into something she had not yet seen in him. Not anger at her, but a controlled, weary anger at a world that persisted in trying to reduce him to an arrangement of land and blood. There was an understanding once discussed between our fathers, he admitted, when I was 17 and Sophronia Vane was a child of 12, and neither of us was ever consulted on the matter, nor has either of us given a single word of encouragement to it since we were grown enough to have opinions of our own. Sophronia herself is engaged, quite happily, to a baronet in Yorkshire, and has been these 6 months. My aunt's information, Eleanor, is a year out of date, and considerably more convenient to her own notion of my duty than to any actual fact. He crossed to where she sat and knelt before her, taking her hands as he had once taken them in the dirt among the asters. I will not pretend that my family, and half this county besides, would prefer I marry advantage rather than affection, but I have spent 11 months being told what my duty required of me, Eleanor, and I have discovered that the only duty I have any wish left to honour is the one I owe to my own conscience, and to you for the wrong I have already done you once. I will not let my aunt's convenient arithmetic do to us what my own cowardice so nearly did. It was, in its way, a second unmasking, not of a false name this time, but of a false fear, and Eleanor found, as she looked down at his hands wrapped around her own, that she believed him more completely for having watched him refuse to let the lie stand even for the length of a single afternoon. Lady Farnham's ball, held at the close of that same week to mark the season's midpoint, was to have been Cassandra's evening. The gown had been chosen weeks before, the dance card all but promised, but the whole of the county's interest, Eleanor understood with dread as the carriages began arriving, would now be fixed on her instead, the plain elder Winslow daughter who had, by some inexplicable trick of fortune, captured the attention of the reclusive Marquess of Ashcombe, and who had not, as far as anyone could determine, yet accepted him. She wore grey again, out of habit more than design, though Cassandra had insisted at the last moment on lending her a length of pale blue ribbon for her hair, murmuring that grey suited a ledger-keeper and not a woman who had, whether she wished it or not, become the evening's central curiosity. She saw him the moment she entered the ballroom. He stood near the far windows, apart from the crowd that orbited him at a careful, respectful distance, and though he wore the fine dark coat of his rank, and stood with the bearing of a man born to command a room, she saw, beneath it, the same stillness she had first met among the asters. A man enduring, rather than enjoying, the attention fixed upon him. His eyes found hers across the room within moments, and something in his face, a controlled, careful hope, quickly schooled into neutrality, told her he had been watching the door long before she arrived. He did not approach her at once, and she understood, with a small ache of gratitude, that he was keeping his promise. He would not press her. It was she who, after nearly an hour of dancing with partners whose names she forgot as soon as the set ended, found herself drawn, almost against her own will, toward the quiet alcove near the orangery doors, where he had at last retreated from the worst of the crowd's attention. "You came," he said simply, when she reached him. "I was invited," she said. And then, more honestly, "And I found I wished to see you, though I am not entirely certain what I mean to say." "You need not say anything you are not ready to say." "I have been thinking," she said, about the Astors. He looked at her, puzzled and attentive. You told me that first morning that they had not taken root yet, and that another careless step would undo them entirely. I have thought of little else these past days, but how much of what grew between us in that garden felt, at the time, exactly like that, something delicate, newly planted, that I was terrified of trampling through my own carelessness. It did not once occur to me that the greater danger was not my carelessness at all, but that the ground itself was not what I believed it to be. She drew a breath. But I went back this morning, my lord, before breakfast, as I used to, and the Astors have taken root after all, despite everything. They are blooming. Something in his face broke open, cautious hope overtaking the careful neutrality he had held all evening. Eleanor, I am not finished, she said, though gently. I do not forgive easily, my lord, and I will not pretend that what passed has not left a mark, that I have spent a great deal of my life being the daughter nobody troubled to truly see, and for 1 month, whatever else was untrue. I do not believe that was untrue. I do not believe you were performing curiosity you did not feel. I have decided, and it has taken me the better part of a week to decide it, that I would rather risk being wrong about you than spend the rest of my life certain of being right about everyone else who has only ever wanted the useful, unremarkable version of me. He crossed the small distance between them before she had finished speaking, close enough now that the noise of the ball seemed to recede to a distant murmur behind them. I do not deserve the risk you are choosing to take on me, he said. But I promise you, on whatever honour I have left after this past month's cowardice, that I will spend however long you require proving myself worthy of it, not as a Marquess offering a title. As Hartley still, underneath all of this, the man who told you the truth in the orangery even when he could not yet tell you his name. It was at that precise moment, with a cruelty that only genuine drama seems able to arrange, that Priscilla Dean's voice rose sharply from across the ballroom, pitched deliberately to Carrie. Well, she said, to a cluster of avidly listening guests, I did wonder how long it would take the elder Miss Winslow to secure her prize, once she understood what manner of gardener she had stumbled upon. Rather clever of her mother, don't you think, to send the plain daughter wandering the grounds each morning while the pretty ones slept? One does wonder whether the whole business was arranged from the very first. The words landed like a slap. Conversation nearby faltered, then quickened with fresh, delighted scandal, and Eleanor felt the old, familiar heat of humiliation rise in her chest, the sense so deeply worn into her by years of being overlooked, that she must have done something to deserve this exposure, that the fault, somehow, must be hers. But before she could speak, before she could even fully absorb the insult, Julian moved. He crossed the ballroom floor with a stride that silenced conversation faster than any raised voice could have done, and the crowd parted before him with the instinctive deference of people who had, until this moment, only half believed the rumours of the reclusive Marquess's return to society. Miss Dean, he said, his voice pitched to carry precisely as far as hers had, no farther and no less. I will thank you not to speak of Miss Winslow's character in a manner you would not dare speak of it to her face, and I will remind this room, since it seems inclined to require reminding, that Miss Winslow did not know who I was for the better part of a month, and treated me with more genuine kindness in that month, believing me a common gardener with nothing to offer her, than this entire ballroom has shown me in the 11 months since I inherited a title none of you troubled to console me over losing my brother to earn. If there was calculation in this courtship, Miss Dean, I assure you it was entirely my own, in choosing to hide behind a false name, because I trusted no one in rooms such as this one to look at me and see anything beyond what I might be worth to them. Miss Winslow proved me wrong. I would ask that the rest of you have the grace to do the same, rather than the smaller grace of simply holding your tongues. The silence that followed was absolute. Priscilla Dean's face had gone the colour of raw linen. Somewhere near the punch table, Eleanor's mother had pressed both hands to her mouth. Whether in horror or triumph, it was impossible, in the moment, to say. Julian turned from the frozen room and looked only at Eleanor, and in front of the whole assembled county, in front of every gossiping tongue that had spent a fortnight speculating over what she was worth, he took her hand, not the hand of a Marquess claiming a prize, but the same steady, careful grip he had offered her the very first morning, helping her rise from the ruined flower bed, and said, quietly enough now, that it was meant only for her, though the whole room strained to hear it regardless. I am done hiding what I feel for you behind any name at all, Eleanor. I do not care what this room believes of the arrangement. I care only what you believe of me. Will you let me court you plainly, as myself, in full daylight, with nothing left concealed, and let the rest of the county make of it whatever foolishness it likes? Eleanor looked around the ballroom, at Priscilla Dean's stricken face, at her mother's astonishment, at Cassandra's radiant, unselfish delight, at 100 eyes that had spent her whole life looking straight through her, and were now, for the first time, looking at her as though she were the most interesting woman in the room, and found, to her own surprise, that she did not care in the least what any of them believed either. Yes, she said, in full daylight, nothing concealed. The months that followed were not without their difficulties. Trust, once cracked, does not mend in a single evening's gallant speech, however well delivered, and there were mornings still when Eleanor woke with the old ache of having been deceived, and evenings when Julian caught himself, from long and painful habit, retreating into the careful reserve of a man who had spent a year guarding himself against exactly this kind of vulnerability. But he came to the Winslows' modest house that autumn not once, but every week, in his own name, in his own coat, and sat in the same small morning room where he had first offered his true apology, and answered every question Eleanor's mother put to him about income and settlements with a patience that told Eleanor more clearly than any declaration could that he had decided to be seen fully, in every ordinary and unglamorous particular of courtship, rather than hide behind the glamour of his title ever again. He brought her, one grey morning in October, not flowers, but a small, worn book of sea charts that had belonged to his own mother, who had grown up on the Cornish coast and had filled its margins, decades before, with small pressed flowers and half-remembered descriptions of the tide. I cannot give you the sea today, he told her, placing the book in her hands with a care that told her exactly how much it cost him to part with something so precious. "But I have arranged that you shall have it before the year is out. I have taken a house near Falmouth for the spring, so that Eleanor Winslow, who has never once seen the water in 23 years, might finally stand upon a shore and watch it for as long as she likes, with no one at all to tell her she is wanted elsewhere." She wept then, in a way entirely unlike the grief of that first terrible night after Priscilla's revelation, a weeping that came not from loss, but from the strange, overwhelming relief of discovering that she had, after everything, been remembered, that a single unguarded confession made in an orangery weeks before he had ever meant to fall in love had lodged itself in him and been carried quietly, faithfully, toward the day he could finally make it true. They were married the following June in the small stone chapel at Ashcombe Park, among the very gardens where he had first knelt in the dirt and scolded her for her carelessness. Eleanor insisted, over her mother's mild protests, that the ceremony be held not in the grand ballroom where the county's gossip had once tried to shame her, but in the orangery itself, its glass panes long since repaired, its beds of asters, the very ones she had once trampled, grown thick and bright and unmistakably, defiantly alive. Julian stood waiting for her there in the soft June light, dressed not in the fine dark wool of a marquess, but, by his own private request, in a coat so plain and unremarkable that more than one guest whispered, with real fondness now rather than malice, that the Marquess of Ashcombe still could not quite bring himself to stop dressing like the gardener who had first won his own wife's heart. "I once told you," he said quietly, as she reached him, the whole assembled county falling hushed to hear it, "that I would rather you loved the truest version of me than the title that came attached to it. I did not expect, that first morning among the asters, that the truest version of myself would turn out to be the happiest one too." "I once told you," Eleanor answered, her voice steady though her eyes were bright, "that I was sorry for trampling something you had built with such care. I find, 3 seasons later, that I am not sorry at all. For if I had watched my step that morning, my lord, I should never have met you kneeling in the dirt, and I should never have learned that the most powerful man in the county could also be the gentlest one I had ever known." He laughed then, low and unguarded, the sound of a man who had spent 11 months forgetting how, and took her hands, soil long since scrubbed from beneath his nails, though neither of them, in that moment, would have minded if it had not been. And there, among the asters that had somehow, against every early fear, taken root and bloomed and endured, Eleanor Winslow became a marchioness, not because any family's careful arithmetic had arranged it, but because a plain and overlooked woman had once knelt in a stranger's garden to make an honest apology, and found, waiting there in the dirt beside her, the one heart in the whole county that had been waiting all along to be seen exactly as it truly was. The county spoke of it for years afterward, not the scandal, though that had its season of delicious currency, but the story that outlasted it, how the plainest Winslow daughter, the one no one thought to watch, had been chosen, in full view of everyone who had once overlooked her, not for what she might bring to a great house, but simply for who she had been all along, when she believed no one of consequence was watching at all. And every spring, when the asters bloomed again along the orangery wall, the Marchioness of Ashcombe walked the same garden path at dawn, her husband's hand often in hers, and told anyone who asked that the secret to a lasting marriage was not grand declarations or careful strategy, but the willingness to kneel, without pride, in the dirt beside someone you had wronged, and stay there long enough to help them grow. Years later, when their own daughter was old enough to run barefoot through the orangery in the early mist, chasing after a father who still, on quiet mornings, could be found kneeling among the flower beds with soil beneath his nails, Eleanor would sit on the same low stone wall where she had once confessed she had never seen the sea, and watch the two of them together, and think that no ballroom, no title, no careful arithmetic of fortune and blood could ever have promised her a happiness so complete as the one she had stumbled into by trampling a stranger's flowers and, without knowing it, kneeling down to mend what she had broken. It was said, long after, by those who remembered the scandal and lived to see how it ended, that the whole county had learnt that summer a lesson it never quite forgot, that the truest nobility was not worn in a title at all, but carried quietly, humbly, in the willingness of a heart to be honest, however plain the disguise it first chose to wear. And on the anniversary of their wedding each June, without fail, a single fresh aster would appear at dawn upon the sill of Eleanor's window, left there by a husband who never once, in all the years that followed, forgot the exact moment he had first been seen, not as a Marquess, not as a name, but simply, wholly, as himself.